so I will start the conference, the webinar. Welcome to the second webinar we're holding today on stimulating peripheral activity to relieve conditions, SPARC. Some of you attended the earlier webinar at noon where we provided the general information about SPARC. And this particular session we're holding is to talk specifically to the spinal stimulation community and speaking about how we can gather the spinal stimulation community towards next steps and possibly using SPARC as a potential mechanism for moving on with the next steps. All right, so just to recap for those of you who weren't on the morning session, SPARC is a new Common Fund program at the NIH called Stimulating Peripheral Activity to Relieve Conditions. It is composed of 4 research components. The first one is on functional mapping and innervation of major internal organs. And we are promoting this activity to try to understand the mechanisms of action for the peripheral nervous system, in particular, autonomic control of end organ function. The idea is that SPARC is intended to change the culture of the field of neuromodulation to help bring about the understanding of the mechanisms first before we develop the next generation therapies. And so the idea is that we would like to promote the coordination of mapping multiple end organs and in a comprehensive way to functionally map them to understand the mechanisms of action. That is the first initiative. The second initiative is to promote next generation tools to help with the functional mapping, and I'll get more into it in a few minutes. But again, it's tools to help with functional mapping. And then the third component is to develop existing market-approved technology for new market indications, and so I'll also have a special slide on that. And the fourth activity is a data coordination, mapping, and modeling center. So all 4 of these components interact in the SPARC program to collect the new mapping data and the mechanisms of action to inform the next generation neuromodulation therapies. The second phase of SPARC will be towards developing those therapies, but we're in the current phase where we're still in the discovery phase of developing and understanding the maps. So these funding opportunities that are currently out on the street, and I'll go to the website as soon as this presentation is over, these funding opportunities currently follow the other transaction mechanism, which is a new mechanism at the NIH. It's not like any other mechanism you may have heard before. It is called OT, other transaction, and the way we've configured the other transaction mechanism for SPARC is described in this slide. And so if you'll look at our RFAs and funding opportunities, we have an OT1 phase, a pre-application phase, in which applicants can send in pre-applications, basically a formalized white paper or letter of intent to describe to us what they intend to do in their project. And this will undergo a review, and based on the review outcome, we'll either advise the applicant to go on to a full application, which is called an OT2, or if there's a receipt date available, to resubmit for another OT1. And so in the OT mechanism, there's a lot more negotiation available for the applicant during the other transaction authority phases. And so once you submit the full application, we'll have a review, and then again, we will then, based on the review, negotiate benchmarks and continue based on the negotiations whether or not we would issue the award. So the OT mechanism really allows for maximum flexibility and fluidity within the whole application process from start in terms of the application submission to review, to award, to monitoring. We can bring in other components. We can bring in other partners and entities. We can mix and match There's an option to obtain supplemental funding based on the evolving programmatic needs. So if you imagine, this is probably the most fluidic mechanism we have at the NIH to allow the program to move in an accelerated pace. So as I mentioned, the first component, the biological component, is all about functional mapping. And so there is out on the street a call for comprehensive functional mapping, and it accepts both the OT1 and OT2 mechanism, and the next receipt date is May 16th. And again, this initiative is to promote applications for studying detailed predictive functional and anatomic neural circuit maps for neural control of medically relevant functions of a specific organ and its functionally associated structures. So thinking about your community, I think this particular initiative will be highly relevant to a lot of the discussions this community is having in terms of producing the important optimized functional maps for spinal stimulation. Another initiative where we are accepting OT2 applications, this would be contingent upon you all submitting an OT1. So if you haven't submitted an OT1, then you couldn't respond to this one. But this is more of a smaller version of the comprehensive mapping project where you identify areas where there's certainly a gap in a particular circuit, and you need to understand those gaps first before you can go on to the comprehensive functional mapping, and that's what this other foundational functional mapping, OT2, is all about. The technology funding opportunities, if you're following Spark, we've already funded 12 U18 technology awards. These are cooperative agreements that were funded in September. If you want to see the awards that we funded, if you go on the main page of Spark, and on the bottom right table, there's a table of the awards in icon form based on the categories of the awards based on technology and based on organ system, and you can click on those icons and you can get to their reporter page and see what those projects are all about. So this group is up and running and very actively promoting the Spark deliverables for technologies to understand the control of organ function. So this technology initiative actually that's currently on the street is a follow-up to the U18 funding opportunity, where we're actually promoting further technology development through the OT mechanism. We've expanded the types of technologies that we are soliciting for technologies to understand control of organ function. Again, these are tools and technologies to elucidate the neurobiology and neurophysiology underlying the autonomic control of organs in health and disease. So again, technologies to help with mapping. The third opportunity is a U18 funding opportunity, and again, it's to promote preclinical development of existing market-approved devices to support new market indications. And this particular U18 project is to support preclinical testing in animals of existing neuromodulation devices in support of other indications through collaboration with Spark's industry partners. We have a device portal, which I can also show you during our Q&A session. In the device portal, you'll see the application process in which we sort of walk you through the process of engaging the company and preparing your application, negotiating benchmarks with you based on this process. The current industry partners are listed here, and we also have template agreements on the Spark website for you to use to develop these partnerships through memorandums of understanding, confidential disclosure agreements, and collaborative research agreements. So again, just to recap, Spark really is supposed to be a very dynamic, interactive, accelerated process using the OT mechanisms, in which we have the components for functional mapping, we have the component for developing technologies to help with functional mapping, we have the component for looking at existing market-approved technologies for new market indications. All of these are interacting together in terms of sharing tools, resources, data, analytics, and modeling. And we have component 4, which is the ultimate Spark deliverable, in which everything that is done in Spark will be coordinated by a data coordination center, in which the data analytics and modeling will be used to help share these resources between the different components and produce a dynamic functional map for the community to use as part of the legacy of Spark for the community. And all this will be coordinated by NIH program staff along with the Spark program manager to help conduct the other transaction process in an accelerated and fluidic way, as I mentioned. So the contacts for the Spark program are listed here. Dan Tagley is currently the coordinator and industry liaison. Jill Carrington is the biology coordinator. I'm coordinating technology. Dan Tagley is also coordinating the new market indications. Vinay Pai is the data coordination, data center person. Mary Perry and Christina Falk are instrumental in helping us work with the Office of the Director at the NIH. So this is the Spark website, and I'll go to it after our question and answer. I'll move on to the next part of this slide deck, and I'll try to allow it so that we'll have time for question and answers after I finish this next phase. So I will start by saying that we have gathered you together today as the spinal stimulation community to gather around this document that many of you on the phone now have helped create. So for those of you who weren't part of the participation in the formation of this document, NIBIB recognized that there was a need to gather the spinal stimulation community together. We had our first meeting in November of 2014, and we had several meetings with people interested from the community to continue discussions on what are the next steps for epidural spinal stimulation for spinal cord injured individuals. Excuse me. And so this framework document that's currently posted on our website describes the next steps that these discussions produced, and these discussions are to promote the study of epidural spinal stimulation to improve bowel, bladder, and sexual function in individuals with spinal cord injury. And again, this is posted on the NIBIB website. If you search for NIBIB and spinal, it'll be the first one on the list that you'll find, and you can click on the report and you'll see the report. So the remaining part of this slide deck really is to walk you through some of the things that we had talked about in this framework and to help you sort of connect the dots on how this framework can be used within the Spark, in the context of Spark, to move forward for your spinal stimulation community. And I just want to let you know that I had mentioned to those attendees in the earlier talk today that if anyone is interested in having a question and answer session for other communities who might be interested in Spark, we're happy to organize one as well. So moving forward, I will go on to the framework that is on the website. And so the idea of this portion of the talk is basically to encourage you to read the framework and to use the framework and possibly use Spark as a mechanism for applying for funding to use the framework. So the first thing we want to talk about is possibly having you conduct a pilot study to gather data to support the design of a future definitive trial for FDA approval clearance. These studies could be to gather objective data to test the hypotheses that spinal stimulation improves bladder, bowel, and sexual function in subjects with spinal cord injury. They could establish the safety of spinal stimulation in spinal cord injured subjects. They could be used to define stimulation and mapping parameters that can be reliably transferred across sites. And so again, as I put this in red, because this could be something that could be very responsive to the Spark Comprehensive OT initiative. Define a scalable overall treatment strategy, define appropriate patient population, and address feasibility questions for a larger study, and improve the understanding of the anatomy and physiology of relevant systems. And I believe that's what I have for this slide. I'll pause here and see if anyone else from NIBIB or anyone else who participated in the framework development would like to make any comments at this point. Otherwise, I'll move on to the next slide. Okay. So the next slide is on the types of study attributes for these potential pilot studies. So these study attributes are possibly to include blinding to evaluate the contribution of placebo effects, multiple sites to assess reproducibility, at least one site that is not experienced with the treatment approach to assess transferability, and minimum number of patients and sites to address pilot goals, and not serve as a definitive trial, of course, but to have these study attributes. Now, I have more study attributes to talk about, but I will unmute everyone to see if there's any comments at this point.
Grace, this is Vivian.
Yes.
I just have a question that would help me clarify my understanding of SPARC.
Okay.
When I started talking with people about SPARC early on, it was very, very much peripheral nerve and nothing else. Is the spinal cord the peripheral nerve from this perspective?
Well, great question. So technically, anatomically speaking, the spinal cord is in the central nervous system, but the Brain Initiative is not covering the spinal cord. And so if you look at our initiatives, and again, we've tried to make it clear that we welcome study of the spinal cord as part of the peripheral nervous system. And we actually especially emphasize using spinal stimulation as a means for mapping.
Perfect.
So yes, it would be responsive.
Perfect.
So Grace, this is Dr. Poon, if I may follow up on this question.
Sure, go ahead.
So, so I'm still a little puzzled because I submitted an OT1 earlier proposing to map a spinal aberrant pathway that would stimulate or disinhibit breathing, that is lung ventilation. But then the OT1 review summary says, there's no viable neuromodulation stimulation pathway in the periphery leading to an end organ was being proposed. So that gave me a feeling that it seems like spinal cord or spinal nerves are not included. Well, as a matter of fact, the spinal nerves that we're talking about really come from peripheral sensors in peripheral nerves. So, but then the spinal cord, of course, is a common modulatory pathway that is easier to access those nerves than elsewhere. So there's a little confusion, what the expectation or whether, where's the boundary is as far as peripheral stimulation or inhibition is concerned.
Right. Well, thank you, Dr. Poon, for your question. It may be, I don't know if you've already had your negotiations with the person who talked to you about the outcomes of your OT1 review, but it may be in the context of your particular proposal. If you want, we can have further discussions offline, but it may be that the reviewers believe that the pathways that you were mapping were more towards the central nervous system in the brain rather than the spinal cord. I don't have those details or anything right now to talk about, but perhaps we can continue offline. That's okay?
Okay.
So,
are there any other questions?
Another question?
Okay, go ahead.
This is Naomi Kleitman. The question, and I've had this question all along, in terms of making sure that the review environment is in tune with what you're programmatically telling people, are you confident that we're not getting mixed messages?
I'm pretty confident because the OT1 review is more of a programmatic review. It really is more of a responsiveness review. So if there are specific issues in terms of understanding the responsiveness, that's something that you could discuss with the program manager conducting the OT1 review. But that is why the OT mechanism was broken up into an OT1 and an OT2 process, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page in terms of responsiveness to SPARC.
Great, thank you very much.
Sure. Okay, if there aren't any other questions, I'll move on to the next slide, which are further study attributes that are gleaned from the framework document that's posted online. And that is to have a pilot study in which one site serve as a lead center to coordinate in the developing of a mutually acceptable protocol, for example, to specify inclusion-exclusion criteria, prescribing uniformly acceptable routine adjunct management and therapy, establishing a single optimization protocol for tailoring stimulation pattern requirements for individual patients, and to establish objective quantitative measures for bladder, bowel, and sexual function outcomes, assuring that all patients are monitored by an independent physician who is a specialist in each of the studied outcomes, for example, urology, gastroenterology, neurology, and/or neurosurgery. And to select generally acceptable qualitative questionnaires for patient-reported outcomes. I'll pause here if anyone has any comments, questions to add. Okay, if not, I'll move on to the next slide. I think is the last of the attribute slide, is to have the lead center be responsible for data coordination, curation, and analysis, provide an independent data safety monitoring board approved by SPARC to monitor the progress of the trial through periodic evaluation of safety and efficacy data, determine a minimum time for patient accrual, treatment, and follow-up to address pilot goals, and to continue the treatment after the study period to be determined by the individual physician. I believe that is my last slide, and I'll show the framework report page, so you can look at it. Again, if you do a search in your browser for NIBIB and spinal, the consortium report will show up. And I will now open it up for general questions and answers.
Grace, Vivian Shahar here again. So we used the spinal cord stimulation consortium report as a framework, but I take it that that is not only, so the work that could be, I guess, focused on moving forward does not necessarily only have to be related to bladder, bowel, or sexual function, or is that your intent, to keep it within that scope?
Well, the intent of the call is to remind everyone of this report and the discussions that the community has already had for quite some time now, over a year and a half, and to suggest that this could be something where you could use those recommendations from the report to formulate some pilot study. But of course, for SPARC, you can apply for anything you like. But the idea was to have this call to help with maybe coordinating some unified effort if people are interested. That's all.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks.
Sure.
Grace, this is restricted.
Grace, if I may, this is Chris Canarpa. Can I add something?
I'm sorry. I think there were two people talking at the same time, so if you can speak up.
Yeah, this is Chris. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, yeah, what I wanted to ask.
Yourself, please.
Yeah, sorry. To clarify more on the question that was just asked, we have noticed that, people, there's a lot of interest in the community in recovery of bladder, bowel, and sexual function. And we're seeing that there are groups working in small numbers of patients, probably not in a coordinated way. And what we're trying to get through this proposed pilot study, if you will, is a group of like-minded people gathering their talents and their patients to get a greater number of patients so that there'll be a credible clinical answer out of all of their work. And it doesn't have to be definitive, as Grace said, but we'd like it to feed into maybe a greater study, a larger study, with this being the baseline information to go ahead on.
Oh, great. Thanks for the clarification.
Reggie, were you about to make a comment as well?
Yeah, this is Reggie.
If you can get closer to the mic, that would be great.
How is this?
A little bit better.
This better?
Yes.
Okay. So this is defined specifically for autonomic function and organ systems, right? And
For Spark, that is correct, yes.
so this already gets down to the problem of dividing everything up so that when you divide it up, you lose some things as well. For example, the studies that's already been published clearly show a close link between the sensory motor system and the bladder and the bowel. And I think that's an important connection. So I guess the way to proceed with Spark is to, if we were to study that particular aspect of the circuitry, we would basically build up the focus on the bladder and put the posture locomotion issues on the side. Is that the way to proceed?
Yes, I think so. Again, the focus of Spark is on the autonomic control of end organ function. If you look at the comprehensive mapping funding opportunity, we are inclusive of all possible circuits that can contribute to that function. But, you know, again, that's why it's called comprehensive mapping. But again, it would be to primarily inform the next generation neuromodulation therapy developers. For example, if you were to control bladder function, what would be the mechanisms of action and the possible pathways that would be optimally controlled to control that particular bladder function, for example.
Mm-hmm. Well, see, a good example is an approved procedure for facilitating bladder function is tibial nerve stimulation. And that in itself is probably reflecting the combination of the sensory motor function and the bladder function. Is probably the reason it's working, or it's reported to work.
Okay, so I mean, again, this call is focused on spinal stimulation, but if you were going to propose other forms of stimulation from other nerves and multiple nerve sites, that's fine. Again, the process, the reason for the OT1 process is really to sort of flesh out these kinds of responsiveness issues. If you want to put in an OT1 to sort of flesh that out, that would be great. And then you could take advantage of the process and negotiation to say, well, should we include this or that, or take out this, or bring in that? You know, that's all part of the process.
Okay.
Grace, with respect to the question that was just asked,
Sure.
I guess there should be a distinction between bladder incompetence and initiation of micturition, a voluntary micturition. I guess we want to distinguish between those two.
Grace, this is Lynn Jakeman. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead, Lynn.
So I was wondering if you could clarify some of the language that's in the FOA for this third opportunity. In particular, clarify the language about preclinical studies versus what you're describing here from the framework.
Right. So the language in that initiative, and let me just pull my browser over so we can refer to the. So if you do a search for NIH Spark, you'll find the funding opportunity page, and by the third initiative, we're talking about the U18 that just came out. Dan Tagley is the contact. So this is for preclinical development of the existing market-approved devices to support new indications. And so the language in this particular initiative is to support animal studies. So again, these are large animal studies, or well, I guess any kind of animal studies to assess feasibility for these devices. Now, in the context of the framework I just talked about, the framework is a little bit beyond what this particular U18 is promoting. The next phase of the small market component of THRUST will be more focused on human studies. But for the cooperative agreement phase, this particular U18 is promoting preclinical animal studies.
Grace, on this particular one, the commercial sponsors that you have listed, is it restricted to those, or could it be other companies?
It can be other companies. These are the companies that currently have signed on. If you saw in the slides, Medtronic is signing on. We just haven't listed them in the table yet. I believe they should be up within the next few days. But if there are other companies that you'd want to partner with, you could also come in. It's just because these companies that are listed in the table have already done the groundwork ahead of time, so that they're fine with all these template agreements. It just may take a little bit longer for the other companies, but certainly we're not limiting it to just these companies.
Okay, great.
And I would encourage you to contact Dan Tagley or Siavash Verzari to ask these questions if you have any companies in mind.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Grace?
Yes?
This is Jill Heemskirk at NIBIB. I just wanted to clarify that what we're talking about here, although we're talking in the context of the Framework Consortium report, what we're trying to do here is encourage diverse study designs to get to this goal of gathering data that would support a larger definitive trial. And so, for example, although the consortium report at the time it was written was focused on epidural stimulation, we would also welcome a data-driven proposal from somebody looking at transcutaneous stimulation, for example. We don't have a particular study design in mind or a particular approach in mind. What we're asking the field to do is come together and put together small multi-site pilot trials that would answer some of the outstanding questions and allow us and give us enough data that would support a fuller definitive study. And I wanted to comment on Reggie's point, too, about the possible connection between motor function restoration and effects on bladder, bowel, sexual function. I think it would be nice, part of the goal of the consortium, as I understand it, and of course I wasn't here at that time, but part of the goal was to harvest the lowest hanging fruit. And so in thinking about what might be, given the value to the patients of restored autonomic functions, what might be the quickest route to that, and to get a effective and manageable, feasible treatment that could be widely dispersed out to the community as quickly as possible. And so I think I would encourage people to consider building into their study, if they were thinking about combining a study focused on both motor function and autonomic functions, building into the study, if possible, a way to address whether those two are necessarily coupled, or whether it's possible that a simple approach focused purely on autonomic function might be efficacious. So you might consider having the study designed such that there are arms to break those two things apart and see if you see a change in the outcomes for autonomic functions.
Grace, this is Chris, and I second what Jill just said. She said, I think, quite nicely.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Jill. Any other comments, questions?
So,
this is Reggie again. So Grace, this sounds like theoretically the way this can work is that you guys would be able to help the investigators at each stage in facilitating going from one one phase to another, all the way to getting it to the clinic, including FDA and et cetera, correct?
Yeah, that is the ultimate vision of Spark, to walk you through the different phases. Spark is expected to last about 7 years, and hopefully if the money doesn't run out before then, we will be able to get through most of these phases.
Mm-hmm. That sounds good to me.
So Grace, this is Naomi again. You've talked about the community getting together in different groups and building up numbers. How do you see implementing that? Are you expecting the groups to come to you and apply en masse, or are you going to partner and hook up people and suggest mutual outcome measures as you see diverse things coming at you?
Well, that's a great question, Naomi. So I think the best thing to do is for people to really take advantage of the OT1 application phase and come in. Well, I guess the purpose of this call is to get people talking, and maybe one of my questions back to you all is whether or not you're going to take us up on that, and whether or not you will start coordinating among yourselves. And the idea is, if you coordinate among yourselves, you can put in an OT1 application, or maybe multiple people will coordinate and put in multiple OT1 applications. Once we get it in, that's when we can start the conversation and use the OT1 to your benefit to mix and match and converge and build and bring in other partners and think about your ideas and whether or not you are addressing, well, I guess the question is whether or not you want to address this framework and this idea that, you all had put out in the last year, and to use the OT framework to move forward in that way. So I think it's best to have the OT1 applications come in first, and then we can help, if people need better coordination and organization. But I guess my question back to everyone now at this point is, what do you all think?
Grace, can I just add something? Naomi asked a very relevant question.
Yes, go ahead, Chris.
We don't want to prescribe what you do, but since so many of you are interested in this, I guess one way to say it would be, we envision you sort of self-assembling with a lead group and sort of organizing a study together, and proposing one as a group, even with a lead center. Again, that's only an example, but the self-assembly is one way to do it.
Thanks, Chris. So what are your reactions and what are your thoughts and feedback to us?
Well, this is Reggie. Grace, this is extremely encouraging to me. I think this is the best way to get to our targets the quickest. And as I understand it, related to the earlier questions, how we would get organized into effective groups can be a combination of from the ground, that is individual investigators, but as you see these grants coming in, you can see obvious connections, and then you can make suggestions as to how the different groups can connect. So I think that's the best of both worlds, of being able to work with the individual investigators making decisions about who they want to work with, and then you coming up with suggestions of what may facilitate more rapid progress.
Thanks, Reggie. Any other reactions, comments?
So Grace, just one more question, Dr. Thune here. So the framework now is focusing mainly on, bladder, bowel, and sexual functions. Is there any chance for it to move beyond that down the road? Like, some other functions that are modulated by spinal afferents or events?
Well, as I mentioned to Vivian, Spark is accepting of all applications related to autonomic control of end organ function. So, I mean, you're not limited. Again, this particular discussion right now is because we had about a year and a half discussion on this framework and trying to connect the dots and helping people put two and two together and possibly responding to Spark with some of the framework recommendations. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay. Yeah. So, but back to a point you made earlier regarding the central nervous system. Whether or not it's, spinal evidence, most of them would eventually, impact central nervous system function and then directly or indirectly affect other autonomic functions. Mm-hmm. So, are you saying that if any peripheral, mechanism that eventually involve brain function of brain modulation would be off limits as far as Spark is concerned? Or is it just focusing on peripheral and nothing central?
Well, we're not at this moment focused on central brain stimulation, such as DBS, for example. That would be something that could be covered by the Brain Initiative. And so we're focusing on stimulation in the peripheral nervous system to address conditions in those end organs in the visceral system. And so,
no, I'm not talking about central stimulation, but what I meant was really, you stimulate peripheral nerves eventually, be modulated by, brain circuits before it's sending out even signals to modulate other functions.
Sure,
sure. So the brain is part of the pathway. So
of course.
Are you saying that so if any, like spinal or other peripheral nerves eventually will converge into some brain circuits that needs to be elucidated before we understand fully, how this closed loop system works, how to deal with that part of the system. I mean, It will be a lot straightforward if we're dealing with an even motor nerve, for example, and, we don't have to worry about anything central at all. So then we'll make very clear that's relevant to Spark. But then most of the aberrant pathways would eventually involve some kind of a central modulation. So how do we deal with that?
Right.
Well, Dr. Poon, it sounds like it would be most relevant to the first of the functional mapping, which is the animal studies where you could determine what that pathway is.
Right.
Yes.
So that's saying that some brain pathways would be included or possible to be included for that purpose?
Right, so I'm showing the comprehensive mapping funding opportunity on the screen. If you can't see it, double-click on the shared portion of your screen and it'll become full size. So it basically says the focus of the Spark program is on the peripheral neural control circuits for organ function in humans, excluding brain and sensory organs in the head and the named voluntary muscles. However, there is an interest in understanding the basic connections within the brain and spinal cord to the extent necessary to understand the peripheral nervous system circuits for specific organs. Research on neuromodulation through central brain stimulation is not the appropriate focus through Spark. So the purpose of the comprehensive mapping project is to make sure that we include a comprehensive mapping which includes central brain circuits if you do think that those circuits are necessary to understand the end organ control.
Right.
So, and as I said, the ultimate deliverable of Spark is to produce this dynamic functional map of the peripheral nervous system circuits, which will include brain circuits ultimately because of, exactly as you said, the feedback back from the brain to the peripheral organs. And so we will need that information for future development of next generation neuromodulation therapies.
Okay.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Grace, can I ask one more question? Has there been any discussion about the role of the endocrine system in control? How does it fit in?
Reggie, you always ask the toughest questions, don't you?
Well, I know I don't mean to try to complicate things, but when thinking about the integrative nature of all these systems, maybe there should be some discussion at your level about a grant coming in with involving the endocrine control of some of these functions.
Right, and if I remember from the February 2015 Spark workshop, we did talk a bit about that input as well as in terms of, you know, all sorts of possible inputs for controlling peripheral end organs. If you note from the paragraph that in the paragraphs that I just read here, you know, we didn't exclude it. I mean, that would be something you could bring up with Jill Carrington, who's the main contact for the biology initiative, as something, again, you could possibly put it in to an OT1 if you wanted and have it taken out, or have it discussed with her before putting it in. You know, we're certainly not limiting. I mean, the OT, if anything, is supposed to expand and, you know, make everything as flexible as possible. So,
I guess one of the things I'd like to add is, it obviously they have influences on each other. So you really don't want to have confounding factors in a single study. If one is clearly understood, and you want to prescribe it within the context of the study, in addition to stimulation, that I would think would be fine. But you don't want to try to study two phenomena at the same time, if I could put it that way.
yeah, I think Chris Kandarpa, who's our new science advisor, he's really trying to encourage us to always remember the framework and what was described here, to make the study as focused as possible so that we can achieve the goal of possibly relabeling an existing marketed device for providing a new therapy for spinal cord injured persons. And so if you add too many things, it might preclude that process. So that was the idea of listing the possible attributes in a study, in this framework report.
It could be a later study.
I'm just showing the February 2015 meeting. We do have all the presentations archived and videoed here if you wanted to go through that. But that's really the meeting that drove all of these initiatives. And I also wanted to flip back to the different dates. So if you notice, for the comprehensive mapping opportunity, the dates occur every 2 months, all the way to January of 2018. So you have ample opportunity to respond to that initiative for functional mapping, which I think is very fitting of the framework recommendations. Any other comments, questions, reactions, feedback? Please do chime in. Well, if not, this has been recorded, and we will be posting this recording, and we will notify the community when it is posted if you want to review it again. Otherwise, feel free to contact any of these contact folks or anybody at NIBIB if you have any questions.
Okay, thanks, Grace.
Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Thanks, Grace.
You're welcome. I'll adjourn the call now.
Thanks, Grace.
Thank you all.